Hello friends, so today's video is going to be part 3 of my basically wrap up for the Goodreads Choice Award nominees. I've been doing this for both the adult and young adult fantasy categories. Obviously the winners have been announced, but I still wanted to go through and let you know about all the nominations, especially because the winners are probably all the books that we've already heard about, and by talking about the nominations maybe you'll discover a book that you hadn't picked up but now want to. First, I'm going to start with The Chosen and the Beautiful, and I want to start by saying that this is one of those books, you know how there's certain synopses that you think, I don't think that's for me. That just doesn't really sound like my kind of book. That was this book for me. It is a Great Gatsby retelling, and I wasn't sure how fantastical it was going to be or if it would be more magical realism. It is fantasy, but I'll get to my thoughts about the fantastical elements, but either way, I'm not a big classics person. I liked The Great Gatsby more than some of the other things that we picked up when I was in high school. I've read it a couple of times. It's not my favorite. And this story is a very close retelling of it's very similar. So I wasn't really ever planning on picking it up. I've, of course, obviously since picked it up because it was one of the nominees and I had been sent an ARC for it. And I was like, okay, feels like I'm supposed to be reading this. My best friend, one of my best friends who has her own channel, loved it. I didn't care for it. And I wanted to get out of the way right up front that I still think so many other people are going to love it, but I just kind of knew it wasn't going to be my thing. The writing really is very beautiful. It's very dazzling, and I think that's very suitable for a Great Gatsby story because so much of it is the grandeur of everything and the way that this grandeur is kind of hiding the ugliness of all of the characters in the story. So the author kind of takes that aspect of the Great Gatsby and then runs with it because the descriptions are lush and beautiful, and her writing is very captivating. I want to add as well, I already am a little bit picky when it comes to the amount of description we get. And so the amount of description we get in this, I'm kind of like, okay, I don't care. And I think it's important to be upfront about that because hopefully a lot of you in hearing about these things are going to think, I do love all of that though. That sounds like my kind of story. Now, as far as the fantastical elements, because I wasn't sure before I picked this up, and I did have my friend tell me, oh, it is fantasy. There's hardly fantasy in this. It's an interesting blend because it is so closely tied to the original Great Gatsby story. It's just from Jordan's perspective, and Jordan is an adopted Asian immigrant who is also queer. So you have a very different character type for Jordan, and there's definitely a lot more explored with the sexuality of the characters in this than there is in the original Great Gatsby. So there are definitely additional layers to the story, but it's not all that long, and I wish we could have dived into those layers more for my own personal taste, because I do love to just sit with characters and their feelings and see the way that, oh, because society is this way, that's what this is like for you, and it's kind of just, this is the way things are. And there's some reveals in the story, and you get these certain character moments, but I kind of continuously wanted to dive deeper. For those of you who are not like me, and you don't need to sit for pages and pages and pages with characters, then it's probably going to suit you just fine. The fantasy elements were a little strange for me, purely because so much of it is just 1920s Great Gatsby, and then all of a sudden they're mentioning something fantastical. So the magic and the fantasy elements, they're there, but it's not like it's a fantasy world. It's not like our world in the 1920s looks all that different than it actually, well, I didn't exist in the 1920s, but as I know, it's not all that different. There's just the occasional fantasy thing. And I almost think I would have liked it more if we had just made a fantasy world and then had a Great Gatsby-like story. But either way, like I said up front at the beginning when describing this, I just knew that this was not going to be my cup of tea. Hopefully, though, in hearing the things that weren't up my alley, this will sound good to you. A similar thing can be said of this next one, which would be a Spindle Splintered. I was also sent an ARC of this one, so thank you to the publishers for sending me ARCs of both of these. This one is very short, very, very short, and I rarely enjoyed shorter works like this. So I think that it already kind of had that working against it for me. But this one right away, as soon as the story starts, it has a very distinct voice, where The Chosen and the Beautiful, I think, is kind of paying its respects to The Great Gatsby by having our main character almost feel like the eyes in which you see the story through, and they're this observer of all these other people. But then they have a little more depth than Nick in the original. This one, the voice of the character is immediate, so much so that the first couple pages I thought were the author talking to us. Because, sometimes authors will be like, so we all know, and they'll just start writing whatever it is that we all know, or something along those lines. It was so distinct that I truly was like, oh, okay, I guess the author is letting me know about our classic fairy tales, and it wasn't. It was the main character. So the voice leaps out of the pages immediately. This is sort of a Sleeping Beauty retelling in that it takes all the different versions of Sleeping Beauty to some degree, and we have a character, our main character, who has this really rare illness. They are not likely going to live for much longer. They're very young. They're early 20s, and so they're likely going to die very soon. And they have always loved the Sleeping Beauty story because they feel like Sleeping Beauty is the fairy tale for dying girls. It's a very tragic setup. And then by pure happenstance, in sort of replicating the pricking of the finger like we see in Sleeping Beauty, the main character ends up meeting one of the Sleeping Beauties and decides, you know what, even though I don't have anything left in my life really beyond maybe a couple of weeks, maybe there's a chance I can save this Sleeping Beauty. And in trying to help save this Sleeping Beauty, she finally was like, maybe I should try to save myself. Maybe I actually have more power than I think, and maybe there's a chance for a happily ever after for me too. So it's kind of a story about having agency even when life doesn't seem like it's giving you a chance at your own choices. So it's kind of empowering in that way, and it's definitely got its own modern twist to the Sleeping Beauty stories, but it is so short. It's so short. So it's hard for me to fall in love with it. I think it moves appropriately fast and it doesn't waste any time. There's also some really great illustrations throughout the book. So those were definitely really fun, but just I wish we could have had a little more time with it. I also think that if you're going into this thinking it's going to make any sense with the magic, it's soft magic. It's not a hard magic system. So you just kind of got to roll with it. You don't really want to worry about world building. It's truly just, I jumped into the middle of a fairy tale basically at the end, and I'm going to try to change the fate of this person and give them more choice. And you can't probably take it too seriously. Last of the true retellings for today's video, the other two are just more fairy tale-esque. We have Lost in the Neverwoods. So this author is more so known for The Cemetery Boys, which I am definitely interested in picking up after reading this one, especially because this is their, it would seem, lesser loved work of the two, but I have an interesting relationship with this book. So the setup is that we follow a girl named Wendy 5 years before her brothers and her went missing, and then her brothers were never found, but 6 months later she was. She doesn't really have any recollection of what happened, where her brothers are. This has haunted her since then. It's definitely had its toll on her parents. She doesn't have a lot of a social life. She's just kind of thinking for the future. She has her best friend. She's just kind of still trying to pick up the pieces, even though it's been 5 years later, because of course that is so emotionally traumatizing. And it's kind of almost slice of life for a little bit, but then some strange things start to happen when the character Peter Pan, that her mother has always told her about and that she's thought was just this fairy tale person, ends up coming into her life. And then she thinks that maybe there's a chance that her brothers are alive and they're just stuck in Neverland, and that Peter Pan, who is not known to the world, it's not an established story that everybody knows, maybe Peter Pan can help her get her brothers back. However, Peter Pan currently is having some issues trying to track down his shadow, and for as long as his shadow and him are separate, more kids are going to start going missing, and his magic is weakening and he is aging. The tone of this story, I think, leans toward the younger end of YA, although some of the reveals at the end of the book are very emotionally hard-hitting, which I'll get to in a second. But for a while in this book, I enjoyed the beginning, and then we we started to get further in, and I'm like, it's kind of slowing down. I feel like we need a little bit more urgency because, you know, kids are going missing. And there's a couple scenes that I thought, what are we doing? Because I needed that sense of urgency, and the characters would go get ice cream. And I was like, I almost DNF'd the book around that time, because I think that's a pet peeve for a lot of readers, is when there's a lot of stakes and we stop for something silly, it feels like. And we got a couple scenes like that, and I was like, okay, I feel like we really need to keep it going. But the ending for me was phenomenal. I almost cried. And if you don't know, I've never cried reading a book. I almost cry reading a lot of books, but then I'm like, hold it in, keep it together. So this one, though, I really had to hold it in, because the ending to me, I think that if you're somebody who's picking up this book and you're feeling similarly to how I felt about certain scenes, I was able to forgive those scenes because of the end. I still don't think they needed to be there, and I think that you're probably going to get to those scenes and you're going to get frustrated and you're going to be like, I agree. But I really thought the ending was well worth it. Definitely made up for it. I loved the end of this book. So much so that this now, the more I sit with it, even though some of those other scenes frustrated me, and even though there were certain aspects of the story that I thought were a little slow, I just thought that that ending was so beautiful and so moving. I'm excited to read other things by this author now. And like I said, the longer I sit with it, the more that I just really appreciated and loved that ending. Definitely reflects on trauma, PTSD, family relationships, the healing, the grieving. It does a lot of that. The next book would be House of Hollow, and it was so funny because I read Lost in the Neverwoods right after this one, and the initial setup sounds exactly the same. So the setup for this one is that we have these three sisters who, when they were kids, disappeared, and then all three of them came back, but none of them could remember what happened to them. And I was like, when I started to look at Lost in the Neverwoods, I was like, am I about to read the exact same book? Obviously, Lost in the Neverwoods is a Peter Pan retelling. So this is not, and they are very different. They're not alike. This is fantasy horror. I have also mixed feelings about this book in that there were so many things that I personally find disturbing, like plants growing out of people. I don't know what that's called, but I hate it. One time I thought there was a plant growing out of our shower drain, and I just didn't want to take a shower. So I really don't like that kind of stuff. But even with some of the creepy stuff that's in this book, I was never actually scared or creeped out. I would read certain things and I'm like, ugh. And then that would kind of be it. But it is dark. It gets really dark. So even if you are somebody who doesn't typically pick up young adult because maybe it doesn't get as dark as you would like, and you're a fan of the dark stuff, this one gets quite dark. So I described the fact that these sisters had gone missing and then they came back, and now the whole world has theories as to what happened to these girls, and they're just kind of trying to live their life. And obviously it's had a huge impact on them, because it's also disturbing when they came back, even though they're kids, they were naked and one of them had a knife. It seemed like maybe something really dark happened to them, but it would seem that nobody harmed them. So nobody knew. They couldn't remember. We follow one of the sisters, the youngest, and she just wants to have a normal life. Her other two sisters, though, they are completely different. One has become this fashion supermodel, and then the other one is kind of a rock star. And our main character doesn't want anything to do with that. So the story really gets going when the oldest sister, Gray, has once again gone missing, and then the two younger ones think, okay, this can't be happening again, can it? And this mysterious man kind of keeps showing up, and they think they're being followed. They don't know where their sister went, and then just creepier and creepier things start to happen. I think the reason that I never felt personally all that creeped out is because the characters know that they're different. It's kind of established very quickly that ever since they came back, weird things happen around them, or weird things happen to the people who get too close to them. And by weird, I mean character can put her fingers on someone's mouth, and then that person's pupils dilate, and now they want to do whatever you tell them to do. Stuff like that. And the main character acknowledges at one point to her sister, she'll say, hey, I don't think that's normal. And the sister's like, yeah, I mean, but there's been stories about people like us for a long time. So we're not anything new. We're just, you know, kind of different. So for me, it was always just, okay, they know. Because the characters didn't seem all that frightened of themselves and the things that happen around them, then I didn't feel as scared. However, that's not to say that scary things don't happen, because it really gets dark when they start trying to track down their sister and that strange man keeps showing up, and there's some pretty bloody things and some pretty gory things that start to happen. So I thought that this story, the twists at the end, were interesting. Some of them I sort of saw coming, and another one I was like, oh, okay, all right, that's not what, I wasn't sure what this was, but that's what this is. I don't obviously want to give spoilers away. And it was, I think it also tackles the trauma of something like that happening. It's just a more like a dark, grim fairy tale take on a certain kind of being and mythology and folklore. But again, I don't even want to say what that is, because I think that's a spoiler in and of itself. Not dark at all. We have our last book for today, which would be Once Upon a Broken Heart. This is a story that follows a girl who is convinced that the man that she loves has been cursed, and that he has been cursed to fall in love with her stepsister. She thinks that her evil stepmother is the one that cursed him, and so she makes a deal with something called a fate, and asks that he keep the wedding between her stepsister and her love from happening. So he agrees to this deal, but things do not happen the way that she was expecting them to. And then she's kind of thrust into this adventure after becoming what everybody thinks is a hero, but she's not exactly the hero everyone thinks she is. And this fate that she made a deal with keeps kind of coming back into her life, and she finds events almost push her toward him, and it's twisted, and you don't know what he wants, but he definitely seems like he wants something from her. And I have not read Stephanie Garber's other very well-known series, the Caraval series. I went back to see what people think of that one, and it seems like those that don't love it because they feel the writing is too flowery, and sometimes the metaphors and similes are too over the top for them. They don't feel like they make a ton of sense. This one, I typically prefer a more straightforward writing style, but I thought the writing in this was extremely charming and very fitting and very whimsical, and it never, for me, crossed the line into nonsensical. So if you've read her other series and you felt that way about the writing, this one I think is charming, but maybe toned down. I will hopefully get around to reading Caraval at some point, and then I can compare. But I truly didn't think, and I am somebody who prefers more direct, I didn't think that this was too over the top. I kind of loved the writing style. I don't know what it was. I don't know if it's because all these other ones were kind of moody or sad or dark, but this was just like a breath of fresh air. It was so kind of silly and sometimes self-aware. So it's not like it would break the fourth wall, but it sort of knows when it's falling into a certain trope or a certain character type or a certain thing you've seen in fairy tales. It seems to know, and then it almost makes a joke of itself, which I really liked. I kind of thought it was hilarious. I don't know, the characters, I just thought it was funny. I really liked it, and it's very silly. It's very silly, but sometimes I just want some charming, goofy, I don't take myself too seriously. I also am familiar with the tropes in fantasy, and I'm familiar with the YA fantasy tropes as well, and I know, but I'm going to still have them, and then I'm gonna make it fun. That's how I felt about this. So I really liked it. I am 100% going to be picking up the sequel when it comes out because I want to know what happens next. That's it for today's Goodreads nominees, all fantasy, which was really fun. I know there are some others that a lot of you are really excited to hear about, and I will be jumping into those in the next couple of videos that I do like this. Let me know your thoughts on any of the books that I mentioned. If you would like to check any of them out, I'll have purchase links down below. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.